Good morning. We have a number that are visiting, actually. We're certainly thankful that you are here. It's good to see Julia with us. She obeyed the gospel on Wednesday, and so we're happy that she is here with Adrian. Good to see Bailey also. I didn't mention her name Wednesday for being back when she was sick, so it's good to see Bailey as well as all the rest of you. Last week, I talked about bitterness from Ephesians, the 4th chapter. Now, this is the 11 o'clock hour we did. And so, the idea of bitterness and the understanding of what bitterness truly is, that bitterness absolutely destroys. And it destroys the one who is bitter. The struggle so often is seeing that yourself, that you are bitter, that you're struggling with bitterness, and somebody else pointing it out to you, and not becoming bitter that somebody pointed it out to you. Ephesians, the 4th chapter, though, goes on and it talks about this forgiveness piece. And starting this morning, I'm going to do a conversation, a series on forgiveness and what this looks like in our lives. And there's various pieces of forgiveness. The idea that when it comes to us being forgiven, we're all about it. I love forgiveness. When it comes to me being willing to forgive somebody else, I have a choice now whether or not I'm going to forgive them. Wait till they ask me to truly forgive them. Am I going to judge how they ask me to forgive them? And there's all sorts of things that go into it that we're willing to do when it's my turn to forgive other people. This morning, though, I want to start off with Jacob and Esau. As you can tell, if you're not familiar with these two, they didn't look alike, but they were twin brothers. If you know my nephews, Wyatt and Owen, you can understand you can be twins and not look anything alike. One can be a lot bigger than the other. And so the understanding is that they always had some issues that were going on, even from the beginning, when Jacob comes out holding his foot. Later on, Esau is starving, and Jacob uses this time to get the birthright from his brother. And then his mom joins in and has Jacob go in and disguise himself as Esau and get the blessings that the older brother, by a minute or so, was supposed to get of Esau. And we leave that story in Genesis, the 27th chapter, beginning in verse 41 by saying this: So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessings with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Now when the words of her elder son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent and called her younger son Jacob and said to him, Behold, your brother Esau is consoling himself concerning you by planning to kill you. Jacob leaves. I want you to imagine what this was like for Esau. Esau was so mad, and I'm going to tell you, I would have been too. The fact that the younger brother is going to get the blessings. I absolutely, if Tom would have done this, it would have been on. Right? There's no question about that. The amazing thing is, when you get to the next couple of chapters down the road in chapter 32, and that's where the lesson is going to be taken from this morning. Genesis, the 32nd chapter, when you are introduced to this idea that Jacob all of a sudden is going to run into Esau, and they're going to meet. And Jacob is scared. The interesting thing about this part is that there's 20 years that have passed. 20 years. Isaac isn't dead yet, but 20 years have passed. And Jacob is in the area where Esau is, and he sends out some people to go see where Esau is and tell him I'm around. And the reaction is going to be a little scary for Jacob. But I want to suggest to you something. When you're dealing with forgiveness, 20 years is a long, long time if you've allowed the wound to heal. If you've allowed it to become a scar. 20 years is nothing for those that are not willing to forgive and continue to pull the scab off that wound. And there are people that are just as mad today as they were 20 years ago at something that occurred. And so you can imagine the struggle that Jacob was having at the reaction. The reaction is mentioned here as you go forward, and we'll start in verse 32. He just finished this thing, or chapter 32 rather. He just finished this conversation with Laban, dealing with Laban and everything that's going on. In verse 3, though, he says, Then Jacob sent messengers ahead of himself to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He commanded them, saying, This is what you shall say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says the following, I have resided with Laban and stayed until now, and I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants, and I have sent messengers to tell my lord, so that I may find favor in your sight. You imagine what he's saying to him. I'm your servant. You're my lord, Esau. And then I want you to notice verse 6. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to your brother Esau, and furthermore he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. There probably could have been a little bit more to the conversation, but that's what he's told. Your brother's coming, and he's bringing 400 men with him. Now Jacob has an option, a decision to make. Is he coming with the happy 400 men? Are these the great warriors that he's coming with? And you continue on here in verse 7, and it says, Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people who were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels into two companies. All right, so his mindset is that, Esau's coming with his men, and we're going to fight. He's still mad of what happened. He hasn't been willing to let it go. It's been 20 years. So Jacob has a plan, as he always did. He splits them up. And what's going to happen? But then Jacob does something that is so powerful to me, and hopefully it is to you. He is absolutely afraid, and there's no question about that. And quite frankly, he should have been. His brother, the last he knew, was going to kill him. So you can understand the fear that would come with that moment. But he does what God would want him to do. As he becomes greatly afraid and distressed, he does exactly what we said he was going to do. He splits up. In verse 8, he talks about if Esau attacks one company, there's still at least one left. In verse 9, though, he begins to pray. God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, Lord, who said to me, Return to your land and to your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the favor and all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant, for with only my staff I crossed the Jordan, and now I have become two companies. Save me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. I fear him, that he will come and attack me and my mothers, and the mothers with the children. Then he reminds God of this promise. He prays. There are times when you're going to go through difficulties and things that you need to do, and this should be our reaction. We should pray. We need to pray. There are people that are afraid of a lot of things, and we have a direct avenue to the God of all to talk to him. Use it. Pray to him. Talk to him. The amazing thing is, God already knew that Jacob was distressed. He already knew. So now Jacob going to him, he already knew. He already knows if you're struggling with bitterness. He knows if you're struggling forgiving somebody, or something's about to happen to you, or potentially can happen to you. You know, we talk a lot about imaginations of kids. I'm going to tell you, adults have some of the greatest imaginations possible. The difference is, adults now all of a sudden have real world imagination. Kids are like Lilo and Stitch imagination. Adults are America's Ending imagination. Right? That's the difference. And some of you are like, it is. No, it's your imagination. Calm it down. Calm down. We're talking about God and what God is able to do. And what his word is able to do. And what his people are able to do. And the ability for us to talk to him and to lean on him. God, I trust you. I have so much faith with you. Everything's falling apart around me. Do you trust him? Really? The idea of us understanding where Jacob was in this moment, I think, is very obvious. Now, the amazing thing is how God answers his prayer. If you know this story, there is an odd answer to this prayer. Jacob is by himself. He sent off the gifts to Esau, and he's by himself when you get to verse 24. And in verse 24, he sees this man, as it calls it in Genesis, the 33rd chapter. In Hosea, the 12th chapter, by the way, it says he was an angel. But here, it says he was a man. And it says in verse 24, then Jacob was alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for dawn is breaking. And he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have contended with God and with men and have prevailed. And he's going to change the name of the place there. His name's going to be Israel now. Why? Because he contended with God. He wrestled with God. What a weird way to answer the prayer. I am so scared. I am so afraid of my brother and what he's going to do. Okay, well, let's have a wrestling match then, was the answer. However, God answers him. You've prevailed against man. I promised you these things. This is exactly what's going to happen. He answers him. How often, though, are we so caught up in what man can do to us and so focused on it that we literally are wrestling with God in our own way? And instead of listening to his answer and desiring to lean on him and trust him, we go our own way. People are wrestling with God all the time. The difference is you're not going to win. God allows them to win. It's fascinating what's going to happen here. This man is going to go meet his brother, who he thinks is going to kill him, and God's final thing that he gives him, the angel gives him here, a hurt hip. I'm going to be with you, but I'm going to hurt your hip. And that's exactly what he does. In verse 31, 32, his hip is hurt, and then it goes on to tell you why they don't eat that part. But it's Jacob's hip is hurt. So now he's going to go meet his brother, who's big, by the way, who's already mad as can be, he thinks, and now he can't walk. Thanks for answering my prayer, God. So then you come to chapter 33. The great moment, and we've all probably been in these situations where you're waiting for that day. The thing that you think is going to happen, and the day finally comes. I talked about this before. When I was young, there was this kid that I was told wanted to fight me. He wanted to fight, and I would stay up at night waiting. Who knows what I said? I'm sure I did something. He wanted to fight. And so after day, after not being able to sleep, I finally just went up to him and said, are we going to fight? And he said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I wasted all that time, worrying about something for nothing. And I'm not alone in that. I know we all do that. And it's amazing how often the things, first of all, you can't control that we worry about. And secondly, they don't even happen the way that you think they're going to happen. And that's exactly what happens here in Genesis, the 33rd chapter. 20 years later, we see what happens with Jacob and Esau. Jacob goes out to him in verses 1 through 3. And he bows down before him 7 times. And you imagine this man, this one, who's afraid he's going to die up until the point that God answers his prayer. And now he goes down and he is bowing before the one who he thinks, at least in the past, was going to kill him. The amazing thing about this story is Esau to me. Esau we're not normally talking about from a good perspective. But the way that Esau handles this situation is pretty powerful to me. It says Esau sees his brother in verse 4. Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. I don't think Esau did that just simply because Jacob offered him things. I think Esau was willing to do this because he was willing to move on from what happened 20 years ago. Was it still difficult? Of course. It was a horrible thing that occurred to him. But he moved on. This is his brother that's sitting in front of him, standing, bowing before him. And he runs up, as we talked about before with the prodigal son. That's not a normal thing. He embraces him. He fell on his neck and he kissed him, and they wept. And in chapter 35, Isaac dies, and both brothers bury them together. That's what Esau said he was waiting for, to kill his brother. And they bury them together. You continue on here. He talks about the fact that all these people walk by. You imagine as a family in verse 5, who are these with you? An uncle seeing his nieces and nephews for the first time. Who are these? It's my family. Verse 8. What do you mean by all this company which I have met? Esau said. To find favor in the sight of my Lord. In verse 9. I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own. The attitude of Esau in this case, is a tremendous lesson for us. I know some of you have been hurt. I know some of you struggle with forgiveness. I beg you to learn from Esau in this situation. As Brian talked about at the Lord's Supper table, we are blessed beyond measure. Esau recognized the fact that he was blessed. He didn't have exactly what he thought he was going to have, what he could have had if Jacob would not have done what he did, as far as the blessings. But he had all he needed. And he was willing to focus on that. And now he had his brother back. And he focuses on that. Way too often, we get caught focusing on the thing. What happened? And what happened 20 years ago? What happened 40 years ago? What happened 20 days ago? Whatever it is. And it doesn't mean that there's not a time that you need to take to put yourself in a position where you're able to get to that point. But that's what the praying to God piece is for. That's what giving it to Him means. One of the things that struggle with so often, and I think many do, is the comparison in Ephesians, the 4th chapter, verse 32, that's given. Why is forgiveness so hard for us? Because we've been hurt. Something happened to us. And Paul says, you need to be willing to forgive just as Christ forgave you. Just as God in Christ forgave you. The ultimate. Can you imagine if God treated us the way that we do other people when it comes to forgiveness? I think you can, because it would all mean we would be in hell. The understanding of what forgiveness is and God's willingness to forgive us, and we turn around and there's something that has occurred in our lives and we hold it against somebody, even if they're willing to ask for forgiveness. We hold it. And if they're not willing to ask for forgiveness, we allow it to become bitterness way too often. Instead of just giving it to God. Just give it to Him. Over in Colossians, the 3rd chapter, I'd like to end with this chapter. And again, this is just the first lesson of this. But the idea of understanding that Esau had something that was huge that had happened to him. Huge. So the question is not whether or not God's people are going to have bad things that happen to them. There's no question that you have. It's not the issue. The question is, are you willing to give it to God? Are we willing to let our light shine even in the hardest of moments? Even when it comes down to our willingness to forgive other people. In Colossians, the 3rd chapter, it begins by talking about how God is our life. We're new. He talks about the idea of not being sons of disobedience, just like Ephesians does as well. But the idea of putting off the old self and putting on the new. Verse 12, he says, so as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility. Am I willing to give things to God? Am I willing to have the perfect bond of unity of love? To have the peace of Christ in me, even during the difficult times? And brethren, I'm going to tell you, I don't think there's any better year to talk about this than now. You want to see what peace looks like for God's people? Look around in the chaos. You want to see if people struggle with God's peace and trusting in God? Look how they react to the chaos. You can tell. Facebook is wonderful for this. You can tell. You can tell that people struggle with things, which is fine. Be aware that you struggle with it and give it to God. One of the things that's amazing to me in this conversation does not mean that people that are willing to walk in peace, or people that are willing to give it to God, don't care about what's going on in the world. I live here. I have children. I absolutely care. But I know who my God is. And I know what He is able to do. And I am convinced that He is going to be with me, He's going to be with my children, and He's going to be with you as His people. Shine bright. Handle these things as we are supposed to handle them. You have an opportunity when people do things to you to shine brighter than you can ever even imagine. One of the most amazing things to me is to see stories when people have done horrible things to other people. Normally, when I hear about them, it's a drunk driver killed a child of a Christian or a spouse of a Christian. And you read the story or hear the stories about the idea that they went and they met with the person. And the person obeys the gospel. And I have to stop and think, if that was my family, would I go and talk to that person about God? I hope so. I think so. It's easy to answer when we're not in it. But then I look at my own life and I realize there's things that I've gone through or things that have happened to me that are not even close to that, and I'm not willing to forgive. That's an issue. That's the problem. Some of you have difficulties with family members. Some of you have difficulties with brothers and sisters in Christ. I'm telling you, it is not worth losing your soul over. Why not just be wronged, as Paul says? Because our great God was willing to forgive us far more than anything that we have ever been asked to forgive. Far more. So much so, He tells a parable about it. And we've got to be willing to humble ourselves before God. Be willing to ask for forgiveness from Him. Be willing to ask for forgiveness of the other people if we've done something that we shouldn't have. But just like our Father is always willing to do, to forgive His children, we need to be willing to forgive others. So much so, we're told if we're not willing to do that, He's not going to forgive you. That's the choice that we have. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. That's the choice that we have. If you're not a child of God, I'm telling you, you don't understand what true peace is. The world is in chaos. The world has always been in chaos. The world is in darkness. It's always been dark. The question has never been about that. The question is, how bright are God's people shining? Are you willing to shine? Are you willing to show people what true love, true forgiveness, and our God really is like? Are you willing to show people that? I pray that you are, because the reward is absolutely worth anything that you go through in this life. If you need to obey the gospel, now's the time. If you need prayers, I beg you to ask for them. As always, make sure that you're praying for one another. As I said, this is just the first lesson of a few that's coming. So you'll hear every other one unless you listen to it online. But just understand the importance of this subject. We love it when it's our turn to be forgiven. We have got to be willing to forgive as well. If you need to be forgiven by our Lord and our Savior, now's the time. And if there's anything that we can do for you, I ask you to please come as we stand and sing.